the stage founder of Black Hat and DEF CON, Jeff Moss.
Awesome. It's fantastic to see everybody here. It's been a really stressful couple of years, right? Yeah, so I've got a couple of serious thoughts I want to talk to you guys about, and then we're going to kick off our main program. First off, thank you for being here for this adventure. It's not exactly the way that we would have hoped, but it's what we've got, and I think you're going to be really impressed and have a really good time just reconnecting with people, seeing old friends, and learning something new. So thank you for being here. I haven't stood on a stage in like 2 years. I hadn't flown on an airplane until a week ago, since like February, a year and a half ago. So it's all new to me. It's pretty exciting. So it has been a challenging 2 years. And like everybody else, I've had a lot of time to think. And it's pretty clear I'm not going to live forever. No one's going to live forever. And I think it's really important as a community that we think through how we want to acknowledge those who have come before us. So for example, we're all here, but our work is really based on that of others. And we're really standing on the shoulders of giants, and our industry is unique. I mean, it's new enough. It's not like engineering where you go back thousands of years. It's a pretty recent phenomenon. We can identify a lot of the people who are the innovators, who the giants are in our industry. So I think it's important we acknowledge them. Our work is sort of through their work. But I also think it's really important that we acknowledge those who have recently passed away, no longer here to continue with us. And so just if you could take a moment, join me in a moment of silence. I just want us to just think about our friends and colleagues who are no longer here, and just, conjure up a happy thought about them. So if you could please join me, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Yeah, I hope their work lives on through us and through our memories. And so in the last year, we've lost two really notable people who were formative in the early days of Black Hat. Phillipe Courteau from Qualys and Dan Kaminsky. And so I'm just going to say a couple of words about them. And Dan first spoke at DEF CON 9 in 2001, 20 years ago. And you can tell he hadn't mastered the art of a title for his talk yet. It was Gateway Cryptography, Hacking Impossible Tunnels Through Improbable Networks with OpenSSH and the GNU Privacy Guard. What a mouthful, right? And then he went on to speak at his first Black Hat 16 years ago in 2005. And he was a regular fixture at many conferences since. And Phillipe actually predates Dan. Phillipe and Qualys first started supporting Black Hat 18 years ago in 2003. And it's really strange for me to be on stage and not introduce Phillipe. I have his bio like programmed in my brain because every single Black Hat, essentially for the last 15 years, I've been introducing Phillipe. That's how big of a supporter he was of the community. So both have left behind something in their honor. So as an artist and technologist, Phillipe Courteau was a believer in art's power to inspire and stimulate creativity. And so there is an Phillipe Courteau Foundation that is building an arts pavilion in Samir, the Philippines. And they're going to mingle art, technology, and a tinkering space and promote creative problem solving for children of low income. And so if you'd like more information about Phillipe's foundation, visit the Phillipe Courteau Foundation. And on the other end of the spectrum, Dan Kaminsky, the company he co-founded, Human, has started a Dan Kaminsky Fellowship. And if you get selected for the fellowship, you essentially get a 1-year full paid salary to work on your project. The idea is they want to dedicate deep work on an open source project, and it's going to be awarded to a human or humans who epitomize the spirit of internet innovation. Recipients' project will touch on a problem that, if solved, will improve people's lives for the entire internet. It's a selfless open source project aiming to help with no expectation of a thank you. You just want to have the skills and the knowledge to answer the call like Dan did. And we know there are good hackers out there doing things that protect all of us for free, and the fellowship is essentially a thank you to them. So that's really cool. And I'm hoping that as we're learning how this all works, maybe we'll start imitating that, and we'll start leaving some things behind for those that come after us. So those are my heavy thoughts, and now we're going to get started. Normally I go through a list of all the countries that people are represented here, but since this is our first ever hybrid event in the history of Black Hat, both in person and virtual, it's going to be a little different. So I want to tell you the numbers of people that are here and online. 140 different countries represented, and there's 27 countries with only a single representative, and so I'm going to zoom through those. The Andorra, Barbados, Benin, British Virgin Islands, Brunei, Cameroon, Chad, French Polynesia, Gambia, Gibraltar, Haiti, Honduras, Ivory Coast, Jamaica, Latvia, Madagascar, Malawi, Mongolia, Myanmar, Namibia, New Caledonia, Nicaragua, the Republic of the Congo, St. Vincent, Slovenia, and Zambia. So thank you. You are the sole representative from your country. And something we started in, now more than 8 years ago, we've started scholarship programs. And this is sort of an acknowledgement that Black Hat, we're a pretty high-end event, and sometimes it's hard to get your foot in the door. And so to ease the burden, we've created scholarships of different kinds. And you'll notice that we've added some additional scholarships. And the idea is to get those who are just coming up a chance to come in and network and to participate at Black Hat. So the first program is a speaker scholarship program. And this is, if you're a speaker at Black Hat, you also get awarded 2 free passes. And it's up to you to decide how you want to use those. So a lot of speakers give them away to the people they know, people at the university, and try to bring in fresh blood. So that's the first way we try to get new people. The second way is we have an annual scholarship program. And this is where students write white papers, they apply for the scholarship program, and if you pass muster, you're awarded admission. So for this year, we have 149 students that were awarded this. So if any of you are in the audience, can you raise your hand? Give them a round of applause for making it here. Anybody here? Yeah. So they're excited, just as excited to be here as I am. So go say hello to them. I'm sure they'd be excited to learn and meet new people. And in 2017, we started a military veteran scholarship to help those who are maybe transitioning from service into the private sector. And so this year, 15 people were awarded scholarships for military veterans. The Executive Women's Forum is a community partner with Black Hat that's hosting a session this year on the importance of building communities. And they have 50 scholarships that they've awarded and given out to their community. The Women in Security and Privacy, or WISP, is also a Black Hat community partner, and they're hosting a session called Recruiting Diversity for InfoSec and Privacy Teams. They're awarded 25 full scholarships, and they've given them out to their community. And finally, the Women's Society of Cyberjitsu, Black Hat community partner, is hosting a community meetup, and they have 25 scholarships. So we're really trying to think through how we can involve other communities, and so a total of 274 complimentary passes were awarded, which is, I believe, a record for us this year. So Thank you all for taking the time to apply, and we hope you get something out of it. Now, before I introduce the keynote, I have a couple of thoughts, my normal comments. And like a lot of you, I'm sure, I've been thinking a lot about medical analogies. I've been thinking a lot about community immunity or herd immunity. And like in 2014, I gave a talk at Code Blue in Tokyo. And I used a lot of medical analogies. And I was really thinking, is there a scenario where sort of the firewall is sort of like a vaccine? Is there a way to sort of confer an immunity on a network if you take care of your own equipment? And this medical analogy I like because if you think about how doctors approach problems, nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to cure cancer today. Right? You're not going to wake up in the morning and cure memory corruption or off by one. Right? And so it's probably unhealthy for you to tell yourself you're going to be the person that cures cancer. But it's totally healthy for you to say, I'm going to be part of a team, and we're going to research cancer, and we're going to minimize the effects of cancer, and we're going to help people with cancer. You could probably have a very long career and make changes in everybody's lives with that kind of an attitude. And I think that's really healthy for us. And if you also think about some of the other medical analogies like first, do no harm, right? There's ideas here that work well in our world, right? First, don't harm users. First, don't give away their privacy. There's probably analogies that we can work with. So I've kind of put together a little cheat sheet here on the way I'm thinking about this. And basically, there's 3 modes of immunity in the real world, and I've sort of applied that to the digital. First, there's the mode where no one is immunized, right? There's disease rampant in the community, but nobody's immunized. The contagious disease spreads through the population. Nothing's there to prevent it. And in the network world, it would be sort of like no systems are maintained. Nothing's patched, nothing's updated, there's nobody watching the logs. So the malware spreads unchecked through the network. In the second mode of immunity, some of the population is immunized. The contagious disease spreads through some of the population, and some networks and some systems are not maintained. So malware is sometimes noticed and sometimes removed, and it spreads through some of the population. And this is basically where we are now. We're sort of in this second mode. And the third mode is a lot more optimistic. This is most of the population is immunized. Spread of contagious disease is contained. Right? That's what we're working towards, 70%, 80% immunization. And in the digital world, that might be most networks and systems are maintained. Malware is noticed most of the time and is removed most of the time. And actions are taken to protect other systems besides your own system. In this third step, you are concerned about the networks around you, not just your own stuff. That's the difference. You're thinking about the others around you. And there is no fourth mode where all systems are patched. There is no system where 100% of the people are immunized. That just doesn't work. It's just not realistic. There's just too many edge cases. So in the do nothing or not immunized stage, it's the cheapest, right? There's no cost to it. The smallest companies can do this. They're totally vulnerable. But it requires no additional skill or training, and it requires no additional cost. In the middle option, the partially immunized option, where most of us live, you're protecting your systems and applications, but not those of others. So you secure your system by patching and updating. You select good software. You filter maybe spoofed inbound traffic, but you're not filtering outbound traffic. Right? You're validating DNSSEC queries, but you're not signing your own zones, so nobody else can rely on your records because you're not signing. Your mail servers, maybe you check SPF records, but you don't publish your own SPF record or DKIM record. So you're getting the benefits, but you're not providing any benefits to anybody else. You're not helping them make decisions about the quality of traffic or services on your network. And this is lower cost than fully immunized. You get sort of almost the full benefit for yourself. but you're only really helping yourself. It's pretty selfish. And if we know anything, that the internet's so connected, that our problems are connected. And there is also a higher configuration and management overhead, because you do actually have to validate SPF records and DNSSEC and so on and so forth. And finally, in this sort of end state, the fully immunized, this is where you're actually conferring sort of an immunity to those around you. And it's the most beneficial to all the users of the internet, and it's the best security stance you can take. So you probably have the least liability too, because you can show you're taking these proactive steps. It's the most expensive to maintain, and you need better trained staff. And so when I think about this, you'll see like large cloud providers probably in this third category, because they can maintain the staff. And so I just want you to think about, what are you doing to try to confer an immunity to those around you? Are you sort of part of the problem? Are you a user? You know, you're just getting the benefit of those around you? Or are you contributing? You know, are you route filtering your BGP routes? Right? You're doing things to help those around us in the community. And so if you think about that from a network standpoint, now think about it from a software supply chain standpoint. Right? We all rely on the software supply chain. We're building tools and systems based on this. We're trusting it. We're hoping that the people in the supply chain are in that third state. They're doing things to help everybody else in the supply chain, because if they don't, everything we do is potentially vulnerable. Right? They are facing a lot of the same problems that you face in the network world. We all depend on the supply chain being fully immunized, and it's not there yet. So I'm really looking forward to the thoughts of our keynote speaker, Matt Tait, who's going to talk about supply chain and where we are. Now, Matt Tait is the Chief Operating Officer of Corellium, but really, he's kind of done everything, a little bit of everything. So he was previously the CEO of Capital Alpha Security in the UK. He worked at Google Project Zero. He was the Principal Security Consultant for ISEC Partners and NGS Software. He also worked as an information security specialist at GCHQ. So Matt is going to talk about where we are in supply chain integrity, what are the key risks, the core dilemmas, and why they aren't fixed yet. Can we get to a place where we can have confidence in our software that it doesn't come bundled with unpleasant surprises? So it's my honor to introduce Matt. And I'll talk to you later. After his session, we're going to do a live Q&A. So thank you very much. Take it away, Matt.
Welcome to Black Hat 2021. My name is Matt Tait. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Corellium, and it's my honor and pleasure to be delivering this year's keynote at this conference. I wanted to talk today about the topic of supply chain infections and the future of contactless deliveries. But first, who am I? Well, most people know me from Twitter as Pwn All the Things from my various tweets, but I have done real work as well. I started my career at GCHQ, that's the British version of NSA, in offensive cybersecurity, doing exploit development. And then I moved into the private sector, doing defensive platform security at NCC Group and ISEC Partners, as well as at Google Project Zero. More recently, I've done teaching in formal classroom settings at the Strauss Center for International Security of Law at the University of Texas at Austin, and have done mobile and IoT security research at Azeria Labs. My current role takes me into platform virtualization at Corellium, where I'm honored to be their Chief Operating Officer. I wanted to start today's talk with two motivating graphs. We all know that, the past year has been pretty difficult in a lot of physical world senses. But we also think, if we look around the cybersecurity industry, it feels like the world is getting more chaotic, that more intrusions are happening. So I wanted to start with these two graphs. This first one is from CrowdStrike in their Global Threat Report. The number of intrusions, as you can see here, has really skyrocketed this year. Here's a second graph. This is from Google Project Zero. This is the number of zero-day vulnerabilities that have been detected, exploited in the wild. Now, the important thing here is that the final bar, although it's already dramatically higher than all of the other bars, is actually only the months up until now. If we extrapolate that out into the end of the year, that bar looks dramatically higher. The number of 0 days being exploited in the wild is completely off the charts. Why? Well, offense seems to be taking the gloves off. And this is both in the government sector, doing espionage, and in the financially motivated crimeware industry, ransomware. And it's getting to the point now where it's beginning to overwhelm our ability to respond in the defensive sector. Why? What's changed? What changed in the past year? Well, I think to answer this question, we need to step back, first of all. Have a look at the threats. These threats have not really changed in a long time. Governments are still around. What they want is they want to gain access to secret data. But they're not doing this just for any old reason. They want to take that secret data and read it and process it and turn it into actionable intelligence. Ransomware groups as well, they're not after your data for no reason. What they want is they want to be able to gain access to your data in order to be able to monetize it, to turn it into local currency that they can use to buy stuff locally. Both of these actors are very interested in being able to do this at the maximum scale that they can, but at the minimum cost. These costs are real, right? Attackers have real bills to pay and real risks to look at. And this, in the traditional model, means they need to think about what happens in order to gain access to that data. That means that they need to do things like target selection. That, is a bit of work. They need to find some suitable attack surface in order to work out how to get in. They need to use some mechanism in order to be able to gain an initial foothold using that attack surface. And once they're in, they're probably not close to the data that they need, so they might need to use privilege escalation tools and techniques, and perhaps lateral movement mechanisms in order to be able to get to the data that they actually want. All of this is cost to them. Once they've done this, they've got access to the data, they're still not done, right? For the ransomware industry, they then need to notify the victim, they need to negotiate payments, they need to do the money laundering. This is all cost to them as well. And in the espionage sector, they need to exfiltrate this data across their operational networks, they need to process it, they need to do analytics, they need to provide actionable intelligence, and if this intelligence is to do anything useful for that government, they also need to act on it. This is all cost. Weirdly, mass exploitation with zero-day is pretty rare. And I want to go into why that's the case. First of all, zero-day vulnerabilities have become much harder against hardened platform security systems. Platform security has made it necessary that if you want to attack a system and gain entry, you're probably not just going to need to have one vulnerability in that system, but a chain of vulnerabilities. You're going to need to build a full zero-day chain, what some people call a full chain. And these things are very expensive thanks to platform security investments. Every time an actor that has one of these zero-day chains wants to use it on an observable platform, this runs a risk for that threat actor. The possibility that that zero-day chain or that some aspect of that intrusion gets detected. And in the event that that does get detected, this can be a very expensive cost for the attacker. Often, various parts of the zero-day chain are going to get compromised all at once, and these need to be replaced. They're not cheap. They're difficult to build. Their supply of these in the marketplace is relatively limited. This is cost. And for governments that care about operational security, they might also need to now do retooling. They might need to replace burned infrastructure, and they might need to deal with potential embarrassment. This is all cost to them, and this cost means that they're thinking at the point where they're targeting, is it worth the trade-off? This means that for governments, even when they have the tools and techniques to exploit very widely, they often don't want to. There's strong incentives for them to limit the number of attacks that they're actually doing to only the targets that really matter for them. In the ransomware context, things are a little bit different. Ransomware is definitionally noisy. And a consequence of this is that they basically don't use zero-day chains, because using zero-day chains and getting burned is just going to be way too expensive for the value that they can extract from most of their victims. The economics just don't work out for them. So instead, ransomware operators tend to rely on quote-unquote sustainable techniques, techniques that are going to survive from era to era, things like phishing, things like credential stuffing, things like sending macro-laden Office documents. These types of techniques don't scale particularly well if they're not targeted. And in the event that they are targeted, things like spear phishing, well then, this is additional linear cost for every single attack that the attacker is doing. A consequence of this is that ransomware operators very rarely manage to achieve the kind of scale in their operations that would be necessary to compromise large numbers of industries or multiple sectors entirely at once. In other words, ransomware operators generally do want to exploit very widely, but they're just not able to. I wanted to have a look at some of the big stories of the year and see if we can find any sort of commonalities. Some of the stories that have become so big that they've sort of breached through into the mainstream. The first one, of course, is the Colonial Pipeline hack. Everybody knows this. This caused gas shortages in large parts of America. The Corsair hack just a couple of weeks ago. This was led to very serious physical world shortages, caused supermarkets and so on to close. The Nobelium exchange incidents at the beginning of this year, widely attributed to actors working outside of China. The SolarWinds breach. Everybody knows the SolarWinds breach from early last year, which ended up with 9 federal agencies and over 100 private sector firms compromised. Very recently, the NSO Pegasus project and the list of targets, which we don't exactly know where this list came from, but claiming 50,000 targets across a wide range of mobile devices. North Korea targeting researchers, the CodeCov compromise, and also last year, the iOS hacks targeting Uyghurs in China in the Insomnia breach. These all, at first glance, appear to be very different. But I wanted to draw to you a couple of commonalities and a few observations here. The intrusions that caused the really big physical, real-world challenges were overwhelmingly ransomware-based attacks. These are the ones which really seem to cause massive problems in the physical world. Another observation is that a lot of these seem to be driven by supply chain compromises. And these ones which are driven by supply chain compromises do have very high volume and usually indiscriminate targeting associated with them. These things are happening at a much bigger scale when there's supply chain that's enabled. And the third thing that I wanted to draw attention to is the use of stolen zero-day. Several of these stories are fundamentally about stolen zero-day. Things like the North Korean targeting of security researchers. Why were they doing that? They were doing it in order to gain access to this security research. And in both the Corsair hack and the exchange hacks, there's credible evidence that security researchers had found these vulnerabilities, these exact vulnerabilities, and written exploits for them. And at some point between that and the patch being released, or shortly afterwards, somehow these proofs of concepts, these working exploits, managed to get into the hands of these offensive actors who used them, enabling some of these massive attacks. And so I think there's sort of 3 driving stories, really, behind a lot of what's happened in the past year. The first, of course, is that stolen zero-day is a component of several of these high-profile stories. The second is that there's a huge increase in the number of zero-days being detected, exploited in the wild, but particularly against mobile devices. And the third is that supply chains are responsible for several of the really major breaches, and I want to come to this one in particular in a moment. Of these 3, the first one is perhaps the easiest one to talk about. It's not supply chains, but I think it deserves a brief mention. If you're a security researcher and you're building or finding zero days in the wild, and these zero days are high-impact platform security or remote RCEs, you are a target. Governments are interested in taking your zero days, and you need to secure your systems and your vendor communications properly. In the event that you have these, do be careful what you publish. Point-and-click zero-day can hurt others. Of course, it's your exploit, do what you want with it, but be aware that there are trade-offs associated with this. The reason this is important is because in the event that governments can gain access to free zero-day, this changes their economic assessment of using it. In the event that they have access to this for free, it costs nothing to lose it. So the incentives to not throw it widely are very different in this scenario. The opportunity and the incentive for them to mass exploit is much higher. From the perspective of vendors, dealing with this problem is also important. The faster you make your updates, your automatic update systems, and the lower the friction you can add to this, the faster these zero-day chains, once discovered in the wild, lose their value. The steeper that curve is, the higher the risk is for adversaries to make use of it. And a consequence of that is that as the threat actors see this as higher cost, as they see it as being a higher risk, they're going to use these zero days in the wild less often, and that leads ultimately to safer customers. This final point is perhaps a little bit less obvious. Several companies in the past few years have started bug bounty programs where they will encourage security vendors, security researchers, to provide bugs, vulnerabilities, and in some cases, working exploits or even full exploit chains to the vendor in exchange for different quantities of payments. But it's in the event that you require security researchers to provide full chains or fully working exploits instead of just vulnerabilities, or you pay them more for these fully working chains, and you incentivize, you create this perverse incentive for security researchers not to publish or not to report their vulnerabilities early, you're creating some weird incentives that maybe we should have to think about. And I think here is a good exchange between a security researcher and someone from Google Project Zero about security vulnerability that was discovered in the wild being exploited in iOS 14.7.1, the latest version of iOS at the moment. This vulnerability was being exploited in the wild, and there was a security researcher out there who operates in good faith with Apple and reports their security vulnerabilities. Why did the security researcher not report this security vulnerability to Apple early? Well, because they were waiting. They wanted to do additional work on this security vulnerability to turn it into fully working exploit, because the fully working exploit would get a higher bounty. This is an incentives failure at the vendor. Allowing submission of exploit components in parts reduces the overall risk both to you as a vendor, because it means that you get vulnerabilities reported to you earlier in the cycle. It also means that the security researcher doesn't have fully working zero-day chains on their laptop that can get stolen. Building this system, allowing the submission in parts, increases overall security. The second big theme from this year is that on mobile devices, there's been some really high volume exploitation. The amount of in-the-wild zero-day exploitation against mobile phone devices is up dramatically. But here's a weird observation. The reason that we know these are being exploited in the wild is overwhelmingly not from on-device telemetry. This is an important observation because it means that if we're not getting this from the devices, we're only really getting a tiny glimpse of what actually might be happening out there in the world. A lot of these zero days that are being discovered are being left untargeted by governments on watering hole sites. Maybe they're being discovered by threat intelligence collaborations. And the NSO list is a great example. We don't know where this NSO list came from, but we do know that it didn't come from Apple, and we do know that it didn't come from phones. So we know that there's some enormous amount of exploitation happening in the mobile space, and we have no visibility into it. This is a real problem, and it needs to change. But finally, supply chain intrusions are completely upending the entire traditional mechanics. From the attacker's perspective, supply chain intrusions are relatively straightforward. Instead of targeting the system that you actually want to target, you target a system that's upstream from that system. Untargeted supply chain intrusions are the ones that cause massive disruption. There are targeted supply chain intrusions as well, things like single government contractors, things like target-specific interdiction, and things like special-purpose software and platforms like ISIS communication apps. In the event that these get compromised, this is not going to compromise everybody in the world. But it's the untargeted ones that are really changing the dynamic. This is where we're talking about things like multi-customer contractors, things like managed service providers, things like general purpose software and platforms like the SolarWinds software, or things like MEDoc, the Ukrainian accountancy software that was compromised and was eventually led to the NotPetya attacks in 2017, as well as attacking and compromising library code in developer systems as well. Supply chain intrusions are unusually enormous. Let's have a look at an example for espionage. The SolarWinds case, just this year, was enormous. But was it as enormous as it could have been? SolarWinds has 300,000 customers. 33,000 of them are using the Orion platform. 18,000 of those were infected with the first stage, the pre-positioning stage. The second stage, the people that were actually ultimately compromised in order to extract all of this information, the people that, the organizations that the attacker was ultimately actually interested in, was about 9 federal agencies and about 100 private sector organizations. I want to draw attention to some of these private sector organizations because some of them are themselves software suppliers. So there's, potentially in some of these supply chain attacks also a waterfall effect, that perhaps one supply chain attack can get you onto a different supplier that you can then use to do a supply chain attack even further on. In the ransomware case, Corsair is a good working example. This was a huge ransomware incident. It had enormous physical world impacts, but it was weirdly small when you think about how big Corsair actually is. Corsair has about 800,000 to 1 million small businesses using their software, and about 800 to 1,500 were infected. That's about 0.1% of Corsair's actual customers ended up getting this ransomware. And think about how big the incident was, how disruptive it was in the physical world. And then think about how small the actual intrusion was. This is a not household name company and a tiny fraction of its customer base causing that level of real-world impact. And finally, destructive malware. The NotPetya example in 2017 is the canonical example of the most destructive cyber attack in the world ever. This was achieved by performing a supply chain intrusion against MEDoc, the Ukrainian accountancy software firm. And this ended up distributing destructive malware to virtually all of their customers. 80% of this ended up in Ukraine, but some of the estimates put this at a global damage to US firms, to global firms, at $10 billion. The impact of these attacks is really huge. Mobile apps are also not immune from supply chain operations. We saw this year 1,200 iOS apps with over 1 billion total installs were using a Chinese SDK, and this Chinese SDK was compromised with a supply chain attack. The level of disruption here is enormous. Supply chain intrusions are not like other intrusions. We might like to think of them as just unusually big intrusions, but they're not. They're different. They're a different category, and they work in different ways. Unlike normal intrusions, where bigness is not the default, in supply chain intrusions, they are huge by default. The SolarWinds hackers had to actively engineer their system to use a multi-stage process. Why? Because the initial infection was going to compromise 18,000 targets, and they needed to downsample the intrusion down to 100 or so workable operations for them. The scale here just dwarfs everything else in cybersecurity. And these are with small vendors and fractions of their customers. In supply chains, there's no natural breaks or disincentives to ultra-wide-scale mass exploitation. Target selection here is easy. It's all of the customers. I don't need to discriminate internally. Looking for the attack surface? This is easy. The update system will just automatically route my implant, my malware, directly past all of the cybersecurity defenses that the organization might have. Escalation? This is also simple. The updater is running a system. It's running with some of the highest permissions that these infrastructures provide. And lateral movement is also not a problem, because these agents are probably running on all of your client systems, and if they're not, they're probably running in the heart of your network anyway. All of this happens for free in supply chain intrusions. In normal intrusions, all of this is complexity and individual cost. In supply chain intrusions, it's just a one-time cost. So how do we fix it? This is a much harder question. I think the first thing to point out is the government is not going to fix this. This isn't going to get fixed by a collection of international organizations. It's not going to be fixed by the US government. It's not going to be fixed by federal agencies. It's not going to be fixed by a consortium of governments. The only way to tackle supply chain intrusions at the scale that's needed is to fix the underlying technology, and this requires platform vendors to step in. Unfortunately, there's lots of easy-sounding answers in this space, but all of them suck. Things like, maybe we could just turn off updates. But if you turn off updates, then everyone's insecure. Maybe we could ban managed service providers, but that's also unworkable. All of the easy answers are bad, and the harder answers are really difficult. They bring you into necessary conflict with some very, very entrenched, substantial business interests. Ultimately, the question that we're asking in supply chain security is, can we automate trust? And it's tempting to go for the nihilistic answer of no, but the real answer is, well, sometimes. So I wanted to talk about some real-world successes that we've had in this space, because different platforms have taken different approaches, and some of these approaches might help some of the other platforms to succeed. One of these is mobile entitlements. In the mobile space, your app does not have any components running as root or running as system. There's no system permissioned custom installer. There's no system permissioned background updater. In the event that supply chains do compromise your app, it's only going to compromise the app. It's not going to compromise the entire phone. Supply chain attacks do happen against mobile apps, but entitlements limit a lot of these damages. And finally, I want to point out that entitlements can have weird and bespoke preconditions. The COVID entitlement, the COVID exposure entitlement, for example, in iOS, is an entitlement that allows you to access the iOS COVID test and trace Bluetooth system that they've created. But not any app can just ask for this. If you want to have this permission, there are additional requirements. There's some other entitlements you can't have at the same time. And maybe you need to be a healthcare provider, or there's other bespoke requirements attached to certain entitlements. These entitlements don't need to be available to everybody. In the Windows system, we do have an entitlement system, but nobody uses it. It comes from the WinRT space, and essentially none of the important apps in Windows use it. In order to fix the Windows landscape, we need to deprivilege applications. At the moment, Windows basically has two different categories of privilege. It has the yes privilege, which is everything is running a system, and it has the maybe yes privilege, which is everything running at medium integrity. We need to break these privileges apart into a workable entitlement system that developers actually use, because an entitlement system gives the machine a machine-readable understanding of what the app should be allowed to do. And that means that in the event that that app becomes compromised, the ability of malware inside that app to do things outside of the scope of the application becomes dramatically reduced. Certificate transparency is another weird example where we've looked at some intractable trust problems. In the early 2000s, certificate authorities for HTTPS sites were a constant concern. What happens when they go rogue? Bad things might happen. And they did, and bad things happened. The solution to this, quote-unquote solution to this, was a technology called certificate transparency. Essentially, all HTTPS certificates that are minted by HTTPS certificate authorities, and this was rolled out over time, all HTTPS certificates are now provided in a public ledger. And this means that threat intelligence firms or organizations or any member of the public can scan this list and see whether or not any of the big certificate authorities is creating certificates for their site without their permission. In the event that that happens, this is all cryptographically signed. You can prove that the certificate authority has gone rogue. And once you've proved that the certificate authority has gone rogue, there can be consequences on that certificate authority. And the penalties for misbehavior can go up to and including the certificate authority being delisted by the platform. But the platform security providers don't just maintain this external observability in terms of certificate transparency, they also impose mandatory internal audits that are overseen by the platform vendors themselves, the browsers. And a consequence of this is that this observability, this transparency, occurs both on what the certificate authorities do and how they run their internal systems. And if they fail, it gets detected. And when that happens, in either of these cases, there is penalties imposed by the platforms up to including the certificate authority losing its ability to create these certificates. Platform observability in the mobile space is a constant problem. There's a huge industry in the defensive space scanning Windows systems and scanning Windows binaries to look for malware. When you discover a new threat actor, one of the first things that most incident response firms, most threat intelligence firms will do is they will go back and they will look at an enormous pile of Windows binaries and they will say, do any of these other binaries show similar artifacts? Because maybe that's malware that's been used in the past. Maybe there's other pieces of malware that show the development stages of this threat actor working. This helps with attribution, it helps with detection, it helps with working out who the victims are, and it increases the cost to the attacker that these systems exist. They should exist on mobile, but they don't. The problem at the moment is that platform security vendors in the mobile space are actively obstructing some of the security features that we need. One of these is the ability to scan apps. We should be able to scan all applications in a given app store. And we can kind of do this on the Play Store, on Google Android, but we really can't do that on iOS at the moment. It should also be possible to install security agents on mobile devices in order to do forensics. And this should be both post-compromise and also in anticipation of compromise. That we can't do that platform vendors have engineered their systems to prevent this, reduces the observability on their platforms. And a consequence of reduced observability on their platforms is that people that do have zero-day chains against those systems have much lower risk profiles in deploying those zero-day chains against those platforms. In summary, there's 3 key themes this year. Be careful about stolen zero-day. Stolen zero-day does change the economics of zero-day exploitation. So if you are reporting vulnerabilities, keep that secure. The second is that there's an enormous amount of exploited zero-day being detected in the wild, and no device observability. This should be a wake-up call to all of the platform vendors. It's something that's deeply disturbing that we know that there's massive amounts of zero-day being exploited against mobile platforms, and we have no forensics on devices in order to collect this data. And finally, supply chains are just completely different. They completely upend the entire economics of mass exploitation. They completely invert the targeting model. They make massive exploitation the default. For espionage, you get things like SolarWinds, colossal intelligence successes. In terms of ransomware, you get vast destruction in the physical world. Supply chain infections can only be fixed by platform vendors. The government is not coming to save you. In non-mobile space, we need to deprivilege applications, break permissions into entitlements, and impose observability on these applications, both externally on the app itself, and perhaps also internally for very highly permissioned applications. And finally, we should allow legal third-party scanning of applications at scale in mobile platforms. My name is Matt Tait. Thank you so much for listening, and please enjoy the rest of the Black Hat conference, whether you're watching virtually online or whether you're here in person. If you are here in person, please do keep safe, drink lots of water, make sure that you wear sunscreen when you're outside. Thank you once again to the Black Hat committee, to all of you watching, and if any of you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Okay, I've got two Matts. I've got Matt up here and I've got Matt down here. Hey, thank you for your comments. I've got a couple questions for you. And yeah, hopefully we can have a little bit of a dialogue and take some audience questions. Okay, so what you said sounds a lot like we're really in the early days, right? We're figuring this out. We're not halfway through the fight. We're just recognizing now that we're really seriously getting punched in the face, and we're trying to figure out what to do about it. So if we are in the early days, what does that mean? You know, you see in Congress, there's been a lot of interest around the software bill of materials. And there's a lot to criticize about that, but it feels like we're not even walking yet. You know, we're trying to figure out how to even build the foundation so we can even try to stand. What are your thoughts around where we are in the whole spectrum of, I mean, in the military they talk about, you know, you have to organize to operate. Can we even operate? Or are we even trying to figure out how to organize?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. One of the big problems that we have at the moment is that supply chain attacks are really only just starting. They're only, you know, when we look at the really big supply chain attacks that have taken place so far, they're mostly actually with pretty small vendors that most people won't have heard of beforehand. And when we think about, you know, a good example is a couple of weeks ago, EA was hacked, right? And the number of customers that they have is enormous. And so when we start thinking about, you know, some of these really big companies that are potentially getting hacked and that have, you know, numbers of customers at a colossal scale, and we start thinking through, well, what would, you know, the Corsair ransomware event have looked like if it had been targeting customers at that kind of scale? That just completely changes the way that we sort of have to approach this. And like at the moment we see, you know, some of these ransomware actors in particular targeting some of these smaller vendors, what happens when it starts getting big? And this is one of the reasons why I think platform vendors need to start, you know, stepping up and paying attention. You know, the risks in the event that this escalates, and it's, you know, likely to escalate in the, you know, coming months and years. When that happens, these things are going to start looking really big. You know, they're going to make everything that we're seeing at the moment look like complete peanuts in comparison.
So, okay, so now it's the future. We're I don't know, a couple years in the future, and we're having multiple compromises. The supply chain's not just being compromised by nation state A, it's being compromised by nation state A, B, and C, and 3 different crime groups, right? I always come back to the idea of like sort of a multi-tenancy infection, right? How many crime groups can infect the supply chain at any given time? And then do we just sit back and watch for them to fight for supremacy and know who we're going to ultimately deal with? We have some of these problems with real networks. Does it work the same way in supply chain?
So I think one of the things where it goes really badly wrong in supply chains is when one of those groups breaks ranks and, does something that's going to end up damaging those systems, right? In the event that you have, 4 different groups who are all just trying to do espionage, then, potentially you're going to flood the internet, with the sheer volume of exfiltration at that sort of scale. But apart from that, it's probably, something that's sort of manageable. But when one of them, is a crimeware group and they say, what, we're breaking ranks and deploying ransomware to, 400 million devices, a couple of billion devices, suddenly all of, however you try and build that sort of ability to sort of work with each other in the offensive space, you might try and build that, but it's not going to be sustainable. As soon as one of them breaks ranks, it all just goes to hell really quickly.
Yeah, and so it seems like then you've got this dichotomy of you've got the operating system vendors, you've got one group, the free open source software vendors, where you can see everything. You can see the source code, you can do everything. You've got the middle vendors, right, the Windows, the Microsofts and Apples, and then you've got the mobile platforms. And it seems like in that middle space, maybe just talk about the difference between what you think on, say, Windows versus OS X on least privilege or...
Right. So, the Windows system, I think, has, done a relatively good job on things like observability. But, the number of vendors which are able to deploy software to these systems at enormous scale and with enormous privilege is, really problematic. Things like OS X are somewhere in between that and sort of the mobile space where you have, iOS and Android, where most apps are running in sort of these extreme containerized environments. And, in the mobile space, you still have this pathological case of the platform vendor itself, right? In the event that someone was able to break into, say, Apple, and they were able to deploy a fake version of iOS to all of their customers, that would be catastrophic, globally. And, this is something that's sort of pathological. But, platform vendors are always going to be able to deploy software at the highest permission. And you sort of have your, that's sort of in contrast to Windows, where you have, this is a wide range of things, both Microsoft, but also you have things like, all of your drivers coming from, NVIDIA or from Dell. You have lots of software with system permissioned background installers, things like, Adobe Photoshop, right? It doesn't need to have system permissioned installs. It just does, because that's the way that Windows works. And OS X sort of tries to take a middle road. And I think that's a good system. You can install much more highly privileged processes if you would like. You have a much more user control in that system. But the level of things, running with, very high permissioned by default is much lower in that system.
So, okay, so I've got another question. To the people in the audience who are building systems or maintaining large networks, what is that foundational technological building block that they should deploy on which they will, their keystone on which they will build future trust? Is it code signing? What would they do that really enables the next level of protection?
Right. So there's a couple of technologies which I think are foundational and that you really don't manage to build anything secure without. And one of those, I think, is code signing and making sure that code signing is everywhere. And this is for, perhaps a slightly unintuitive reason, but code signing actually gives you a lot more than, supply chain attacks can, of course, compromise code signing certificates as well. But code signing gives you a couple of really important things, right? Number one, it gives you a point of contact in the event that, you discover a binary doing something, suspicious. You can, go and contact the person that is the owner of that, piece of software and work out with them whether or not that's something, that they intended to deploy, or whether that's a problem in their internal environment. And another big important thing is that with code signing, you can mandate things like entitlements. An entitlements-based system doesn't really work very well if you don't have some kind of code signing system on top of it. And also, code signing provides you with a trusted external date. We don't really think about this very often, but this externally imposed date, or this externally trusted date, allows you at a later point as a platform vendor to obsolete entitlements that are you intend to break up into multiple parts, right? You might have a system entitlement in your first build of this platform, and you might want to break this up into 3 entitlements later and insist that nobody uses this extremely powerful entitlement. But how do you obsolete stuff without breaking application compatibility? One of those ways is to use this date system as a way of saying that future builds of this product are not going to be allowed this entitlement as I obsolete it, but I'll honor it with the older versions.
So finally, before we call your session to a close, it really sounds like zero trust is not applicable on the large platforms or in mobile. And so it really seems like we have a disconnect between what marketing is saying around zero trust capabilities, and it's maybe very euphoric, and then what's possible in a mobile platform. There's no way for an external provider to provide zero trust. It has to be done by the platform provider, right? You're helpless but for what the providers give you.
Right. So like unless you trust the platform itself, then really you don't have any trust in any of the things that are running on that system. And really the problem is that zero trust is sort of a long-term goal. It's something that we should try and get to. I think we're going to struggle to get to a point where platforms themselves don't have to be trusted, unless you're willing to build everything from the ground up by yourself. And there's very few people qualified to do that in the current environment. But yeah, you're always going to need to trust the platform vendors. The problem is that we don't just have to trust the platform vendors. We also have this colossal additional set of people that we have to trust. And platform vendors can help work to reduce that down to a much smaller group of people that have entitlements for very important things that they have strong business needs to do. For those types of groups, maybe you can reduce that set down to a minimum and impose additional internal checks to verify that organization is secure before you grant those types of permissions, and insist that if they violate that, if they break that trust, that we'll be able to sort of go back and revoke those kind of permissions, as we did in the HTTPS certificate authority case.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Now, before I call the keynote session to a close, I just have some housekeeping notes for everybody. As you noticed, this was a virtual streamed keynote. This is going to be what happens for tomorrow as well. The day 2 keynote will also be streamed. We have the next session starting at 10:20. Everybody in this room, everybody virtually, the content that you see is available online for 30 days. Your conference pass will get you access, so you don't have to necessarily decide between track A and track B. You can come back at your leisure and rewatch all this content for the next 30 days online. So that's something we want to extend to everybody, just to make it maybe a little less stressful for everyone. Tonight, there's a Black Hat barbecue at 4:30 p.m. in the business hall. And I'll be kicking off at 4:20 our lock note session of the Black Hat Review Board. We're going to talk about sort of the year in review in the conference, have some beers, and you guys can come and kind of sit in and listen in on us having a conversation for about halfway, and then the second half, you get to ask the questions to the experts. So, thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you around the conference.